Everybody. My presentation is on inclusive environmental governance in indigenous communities to ensure food security, livelihood generation, and climate justice. The information presented here were from my field information base and my experience as a gender and forestry consultant in India with Department for International Development UK and my current research with UNICEF on accessible healthcare of indigenous communities in Odisha and India. So in this field research experience, I consulted indigenous women and men and other key informants like village leaders, government officials, etc. So in this connection, I would like to start with the SKU agreement. According to the United Nations Environmental Commission of 2021, when the world continues to tackle the shattering impacts of COVID-19 and step up efforts to curb the triple crisis of climate change, biodiversity collapse, and pollution of the natural environment, the SKU Agreement 2021 endorses the right of access to environmental information, public participation in environmental decision-making process, access to justice in environmental matters, and commits to working to ensure the right of every person to live in a healthy environment. So basically, this provides a critical voice for environmental democracy and is aligned with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development's commitment to no one is left behind and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. This is also according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, for United High Commissioner for Human Rights 2021. Now going to the Paris climate change, the Paris climate change acknowledges the importance of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from deforestation, um, and of sustainably managing forests as a way of storing carbon. The third one is the Glasgow Climate Summit, which advocate that there is a strong push at COP26 for countries to undertake nature-based solutions, a range of land and ocean conservation strategies aimed at protecting biodiversity and mitigating emissions. Now, coming to in this context, what is the indigenous land rights from a human rights perspective, taking into consideration all those statements made in the climate policy and environmental change conferences by the United Nations? In contradiction to international human rights law all over the world, the rights of local communities to use, manage, and hold their lands are not clearly defined or recognized, or where the formal land planning system does not reflect the reality of indigenous people and local communities. The global investment in commercial agriculture and land-based infrastructure carry a risk of limiting, denying, or violating local communities' rights and potentially grabbing indigenous, customary, and communal land. In addition, sustainable land management practices such as agroecological land use, analog forestry, or farmer-led greening are under pressure from these large-scale developments, while such sustainable land use practices are becoming increasingly important to ensure food security and combat climate change, deforestation, and desertifications. So this is according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights 2021 reflected. Then indigenous rights and climate policy. What the indigenous climate policy, does the climate policy had recognized indigenous rights? In this connection, I would like to advocate for indigenous peoples worldwide whose culture, knowledge, and human rights have been largely ignored in climate policy. For decades, concern about inclusion are especially poignant. Indigenous climate action groups say natural solutions that promote carbon markets without explicitly guaranteeing indigenous rights opens the door to land grabs, Conserving nature for carbon offset is potentially a new form of colonialism pointed by indigenous coalition while fighting for their rights and real environmental solution at the UN climate conference in Glasgow. That's the indigenous coalition's voice, and the indigenous action group argued that nature-based solutions to tackle the climate crisis need to be tied to the land back movement. This is according to Direnger, a member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation leader. That means the return of territories to indigenous population and full recognition of their sovereignty and rights to make all decisions concerning them worldwide. Now, I would like to say that how the indigenous men and women, they are contributing for the climate justice. In this case, I'm highlighting indigenous women are the conservation agent. Indigenous women are important conservation agents worldwide, where there is a greater presence of women landowners at the cantonal level. There is more forest, including the buffer zones of the protected wild areas, and there is a large presence of women. Indigenous women's productive areas are generating a significant impact on reducing emissions. In this space, the forest coexists with crops that guarantee the families food security and provide them with an economic income option when marketing the products. There are also medicinal plants and water sources that are protected by these indigenous women. How the indigenous women are contributing for the global warming. Indigenous women carrying inclusive system to conserve forest and use traditional knowledge and practices for food security and medicinal purposes, showing women leadership and indigenous rights and protect the surrounding forest. These community groups as protectors of forest and environment are trained in rotational and regenerative agroforestry and promote the use of local native seed varieties and traditional medicinal plants, improving the community's resiliency against global warming. The community ownership is also managed by the women's groups in India, which is called self-help groups. And they saw the leadership during the time of COVID-19 by making masks, sanitizers, delivering food to the needy, and conducting awareness work. In addition, SHG members of Madhya Pradesh, India started an online campaign for organic farming and creating examples of universalization of farm livelihoods. And the government is also supporting them with these initiatives to take the leadership in tribal areas, which is called the indigenous areas in India. Now, coming into the legal implications, India does have a Forest Rights Act of 2006, and this legislation grants them rights to live on, cultivate, protect, and manage the forest lands they historically inhabited. Still, despite this legislation, indigenous communities often face severe land tenure insecurity and the threat of eviction due to state forestry policies and corporate development projects. In spite of all this land rights and forest act, there is also severe gender disparities. Even though they are playing a massive role, women are playing a massive role in the agricultural workforce. Women face significant systemic barriers in land ownership due to discriminatory social norms and unequal implementation of succession laws. The vast majority of privately held agricultural land is controlled by men. But as an initiative, the state government is partnered with the community organizations, the local organizations, to promote land literacy and strengthen legal frameworks for women's land titles. Now, the Indigenous Land Rights and Title in Canada. So, Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982 recognizes and affirms the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada. These rights cannot be extinguished without consent. So, as an Aboriginal right, this is a distinct property right that recognizes an Indigenous group's historic occupation and exclusive use of traditional lands. In this landmark legal decisions, such as the Delgamo versus British Columbia case, the Supreme Court ruled that Aboriginal title encompasses the right to choose how the land is used, including for modern economic purposes. Now, there is another legal implication of the duty to consult, which says that before governments or private developers can proceed with projects such as resource extraction or infrastructure built up that may infringe upon potential or established Aboriginal treaty rights, they have a legal obligation to consult with and, depending on the severity of the impact, accommodate the affected Indigenous groups. So my point over here is, or my claim over here is that they are the protector of their land, they are the protector of their livelihood generations, they are the protector of the resources that they are entitled to. So they should have been, initiative should have been taken off to build up their capacity building to provide the conservation as in the Paris Agreement, as in the Schedule Agreement of 2021 claimed, and they should be entitled and ensure of their own rights so that they can support the climate justice. Now, continuing my research journey with the Indigenous population, my current research is going on gender equity and Indigenous healthcare in India. That's all about my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Minakshi, for your presentation. It provides some good background to the specific case that we're going to talk about. So hi, everyone. My name is Kate. I'm joining from all the way on the East Coast. It's the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, the original and ongoing stewards of what we call Unamaki, but you may know as Cape Breton. Today, Kaitlin and I are presenting on a paper that we started thinking about many years ago that sits at this intersection of land claim law, Indigenous knowledge systems, and the ecological footprint. So I'm going to start with three things. I'm going to talk about what two-eyed seeing is, why the ecological footprint and biocapacity framework on its own isn't always enough, and then some of the historical context of the paper. The concept that holds this whole paper together is two-eyed seeing, or Etowaptimunk in Mi'kmaq. This concept comes from Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall, and it's become a really foundational idea across environmental research, fisheries management, health research. It's used all over the world. Really anywhere where two knowledge systems need to talk to each other. And the idea itself is really simple. It says, see the world through one eye with the strengths of Indigenous ways of knowing, and through the other eye with the strengths of Western ways of knowing, and then learn to use both of your eyes together for the benefit of all. So I do want to emphasize what it is not, because it becomes very easy to flatten this idea. It's not about ranking one knowledge system above the other. It's not about translating Indigenous knowledge into Western scientific categories. And it's not about treating Indigenous knowledge as something to hold above, as spiritual, as separate from rigorous analysis. What it's about is it's about braiding the two together and having a conversation where the two are running alongside each other. So bringing two distinct, fully valid systems of understanding together so that what you end up with is more complete than either one of those could give you. So in this paper, that braid looks like this. We're running a Western quantitative model, the ecological footprint and biocapacity framework, to generate some hard numbers for the ecological productivity of the territory that we'll talk about. At the same time, we're holding that calculation inside an explicit acknowledgement that in Indigenous worldviews, land is not a passive economic input waiting to be measured, but that it carries reciprocal responsibility. So why does this matter specifically for biocapacity? So the ecological footprint and biocapacity framework, as many of you will know, it's a well-established, genuinely powerful tool. And it's powerful precisely because it's quantifiable, it's comparable, and because it speaks a language that courts, governments, policymakers, they already trust and they already use. But it was never built to capture the cultural dimensions of land use. A few years ago now, Eric Miller and I published on the central findings of some work that we did that showed that footprint researchers know this already. They know that gap exists. And also that practitioners also know it exists. We spoke to them and they were very clear. The footprint can tell you what the land produces, so the image on the left, but it can't tell you what the land means. And that's the image on the right. And that this is a barrier to adoption in their communities. If the methodology can't speak to the historical and relational dimensions of the land, then communities, Indigenous communities, policymakers, legal teams working alongside them, they have a good reason not to use it or to be skeptical of it. And worse, if it's deployed carelessly, it can actually reinforce some of the exact colonial logic that reduced land to a resource in the first place. So our task in this paper was not to fix EFB at all, the footprint at all, or to pretend it now captures everything land means to a nation. Our task was to be explicit about what the tool does and doesn't do, and to position biocapacity as one voice in the room. Then it complements rather than replaces the cultural and spiritual and historical argument that the Indigenous community will talk about is already making for itself. So that's the expanded research agenda in practice. We don't ask the footprint to do work it was never designed to do. We ask it to sit beside other ways of knowing in service of the argument, not in place of it, and to just say so clearly. The Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, or San, is made up of two First Nations, Chippewa of the Nashwa Unceded First Nation and the Chippewa of the Saugeen First Nation. Their traditional territory runs along the eastern shores of Lake Huron and Georgian Bay in what is now Ontario, and it consists of more than 3 million hectares of land and water. San has gone through some legal processes to ask the courts to recognize Aboriginal title, not just over land, but also over portions of Lake Huron and Georgian Bay themselves. This is a really rare and exceptionally difficult kind of claim because it requires proving exclusive and continuous occupation of water using a legal test that was built primarily with land-based occupation in mind. This all started in 1836 with Treaty 45, the Saugeen Tract Agreement. San ceded roughly 1.5 million acres of land in what now is southern Ontario. In exchange, the Crown promised to protect San's remaining lands, particularly the Bruce Peninsula, from settler encroachment forever. San contests the legitimacy of this treaty outright, arguing that it was signed under coercion. 18 years later, in 1854, the Crown came back for more. Treaty 72 pushed San to surrender most of the remaining peninsula under the premise that San couldn't effectively defend it from settler expansion anyway. And I'll come back to that point right at the end. San argues that this treaty was also signed under duress. In 1994, San formally filed claims. They filed for both a treaty breach claim and an Aboriginal title claim to portions of Lake Huron and Georgian Bay themselves. The trial ruling came down in 2021 and it was split. On the title claim, the waters, the court ruled against San. They did not meet the legal bar, which requires continuous, substantial, exclusive occupation of the waters prior to 1763. But on the treaty claim, the ruling went the other way. The Crown did breach its promises under both Treaty 45 and 72. The court stopped short of calling it any kind of breach of fiduciary duty in the strict legal sense, but the underlying finding stood. The Crown promised to protect the land and broke that promise. So that ruling went to the Ontario Court of Appeal and then to the Supreme Court of Canada. And in November 2024, the Supreme Court denied San's application for leave to appeal. The court gave no reasons and there's no further appeal coming. So where that leaves us, the Aboriginal title claim to the waters did not succeed, but the treaty breach finding stands as settled law, not just allegation. The case now moves towards a second phase. This is compensation. So San is seeking recognition of its interest in unsold Crown lands, along with some financial compensation, including $80 billion damages, plus $10 billion in punitive reparations. That remains the number associated with this phase, but it hasn't been tested or narrowed by a court. So San's legal team has already made this really powerful argument about the historical injustice and broken promises, and that part is settled. What's been absent from the conversation is a quantified picture of the ecological value of the land itself, what they're actually, the land that's being discussed, something that can sit alongside the legal finding as that compensation phase unfolds to reinforce it without trying to replace it. And that's what biocapacity gives us. So Caitlin's going to walk you through exactly how those numbers were built and what they tell us.
Now that we've discussed the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation in the context of the land claim, I'll walk you through how we calculated the biocapacity of the territory. So the first step, this was mostly done with GIS. So the first step here was defining the boundaries of the claim area. So since there's no publicly available GIS shapefiles for the traditional territory, we had to estimate the boundary using treaty descriptions, documents, images available on the web from the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation that map out the boundaries themselves and kind of use that information to create a polygon using QGIS, which represented the claim area. It's important to acknowledge that this is an estimated boundary, so we're not claiming that this map perfectly reflects the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation's understanding of their territory, but rather it provides an informed approximation that allows us to conduct the biocapacity assessment. Once the boundary was created, it was overlaid with provincial land cover data from the Ontario Land Cover Compilation version 2.0, which is available on Ontario GeoHub. This was used to identify the different land classifications contained within the territory, for example, marshes, swamps, open tall grass prairie, etc., as you can see on the legend of this map. OLCC is a province-wide dataset which is maintained by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. And it's also comprised of 3 combined land cover databases. This includes the Far North Land Cover version 1.4, and also Southern Ontario Land Resource Information System, also known as SOLRIS version 1.2, and the Provincial Land Cover 2000 edition. What you're seeing on this map is the resulting land cover from the OLCC dataset clipped by the boundary polygon that we created, and each color represents a different landscape type, as I've mentioned. After creating the boundary and using the QGIS function, which is called clip raster by mask layer, to clip the data to the boundaries of the claim, this left us with the land cover information, which is contained within the territory. So after creating the boundary and clipping the data set to the claim area, we're left with only the land cover information within that boundary. We then used a raster analysis tool in QGIS called the Raster Layer Unique Values Report, which is shown on the right side of the screen. This tool counts every pixel belonging to each land cover class and converts those counts into meters squared, which we then convert into hectares and later global hectares of biocapacity. This process allowed us to move from a map of land cover classifications, which you can just see visually, to a standardized numerical values of the ecological productivity of the territory, which will then form the basis of the results shown in the following slides. So once we knew how much area was occupied by each land cover type, these were linked to classes of biocapacity categories using the same classification framework that was employed in the Ontario report that the ecological footprint did alongside Ministry of Natural Resources. Basically, these categories were derived from the OLCC data specifications document and the Ontario report. On the screen, there's a few examples here. Open water was classified as freshwater biocapacity, forests were classified as forest biocapacity, agricultural lands were allocated among cropland, grazing land, and grassland categories according to the Ontario methodology. Some land cover classifications required weighting because they do not correspond perfectly to a single biocapacity category. For example, swamps were divided between forest and wetland biocapacity, while agricultural, undifferentiated rural land use, for example, was divided among cropland, grazing land, and grassland. After assigning each land cover class to a biocapacity category, we converted the areas from hectares to global hectares using the same approach as the Ontario Provincial Report on Ecological Footprint and Biocapacity. And this includes Ontario relative net primary production values for the Mixedwood Plains ecozone, because that's where the claim is situated. Ontario relative yields, Canadian yield factors, global intertemporal yield factors, and global equivalence factors. These adjustments account for differences in biological productivity between the different land types, and they allow all of the ecosystems to be expressed in a common unit of the global hectare. So let's get into some results. After completing these calculations, we estimated that the total biocapacity of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation's traditional territory was approximately 4.17 million global hectares. As Kate mentioned, biocapacity measures ecological productivity here and ecological potential. It estimates the capacity for ecosystems to generate renewable biological resources, support ecological functions, and absorb waste. So one reason we chose biocapacity here is it provides a common unit that can compare very different ecosystems. So a hectare of cropland, a hectare of forest land, and a hectare of freshwater can all be expressed in the common unit of global hectares. And this gives us a way to quantify the productive potential of the territory in total. Importantly, as has been mentioned, biocapacity is not a valuation of cultural significance, legal rights, or relationships with land, but it's an ecological metric that can help to illustrate the scale and productive capacity and potential of the territory that's associated with the claim. In that sense, it provides another lens to view land claims and inform discussions regarding compensation. So looking at the total number alone is useful, but it's also important to understand where that biocapacity comes from. This chart here breaks down the territory into major biocapacity categories. The largest contributor is cropland, which accounts for about 1.59 million global hectares, or about 38% of the total biocapacity. The second largest contributor is freshwater, with about 1.27 million global hectares, representing nearly 30% of the total. And this is not surprising, given that the territory has an extensive connection to Lake Huron, Georgian Bay, and various inland water systems. Grazing land contributes around 660,000 global hectares, forests around 300,000, and same with built-up land. One of the most interesting findings is that freshwater systems contribute a very high amount of biocapacity, almost as much as cropland. And discussions around land claims often focus on terrestrial resources, but these results highlight the importance of aquatic environments, which is important to this particular land claim in the sense that they're also laying claim to the fresh water that's included in the boundaries, as you've seen in the map. Overall, the results show that the claim area contains a highly productive mix of various components of biocapacity. This figure here compares the physical area of the territory with its global hectares, so the productivity adjusted global hectares. On the left, there's the actual area, which is measured in hectares, and on the right, there's the area measured in global hectares. So it's 3 million hectares provide 4.1 million global hectares of biocapacity. This means that some land cover types become more important once their differing biological potentials are considered. So cropland is the clearest example here. It shows that highly productive agricultural land generates a higher potential for biological productivity compared to the other land types. According to the Ontario Biocapacity Report from 2021, it produces 94% more crops per hectare than cropland across Canada, in Ontario specifically. However, as my co-author Kate will discuss in the next slide of this presentation, cropland was not historically utilized to its full potential according to archival records relating to this territory and the land claim. As a result, obviously, cropland has a much larger share of the global hectares column than it does in the hectares column. And this illustrates one of the key strengths of biocapacity accounting. It allows you to move beyond what is just asking how much land exists and instead asking how productive that land is. In the context of this claim, it provides a way that productivity can be quantified and associated with the territory to better understand how different ecosystems contribute to its overall significance.
So I just want to close on 2 points. The first is research that's next. So this paper was really a proof of concept. It was the first time that we had found that the ecological footprint and biocapacity framework had been applied to a live Indigenous title claim. Since publishing, my own research has moved towards downscaling this kind of work to community level, which I know is work that's continuing with this group, but not in this area. So there's work that could be done here. The other part I wanted to just pull out is that shortly after this paper came out, a historian from Garden River Ojibwe Nation reached out and he worked on the SON litigation team itself. So he had direct access to archival records that we didn't have. And he raised 2 critiques that I think are worth just mentioning as we end. So the first was that he pushed back pretty hard on the historical claim that I mentioned when I was talking about the treaty timeline, that's repeated a lot in secondary literature, that the Saugeen Peninsula was being overrun or encroached by settlers in the 1850s. He said there's not really strong evidence for that framing, that it may have just been a Crown pretext for justifying SON into Treaty 72 than a documented reality. The second one is that he challenged our finding that cropland in SON's territory is highly productive. He said that very little of that land is ever actually farmed successfully, even after 1854, because much of the peninsula isn't arable. So EFB's models, the footprints model, it models a region's biophysical potential using these standardized provincial yield factors. It's not a historical land use survey, so it doesn't capture whether land was in practice farmable at any given point. So that's a genuinely, I think, important methodological consideration for future work. And that's it for us. Thank you all so much for inviting us to come and talk, and we're looking forward to some discussion.